We're going to talk about in this video Africans against colonial rule, basically the interwar period, the world between the wars, the period between World War One and World War Two in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, and how things and how events played out there. So quick quiz. Remember the two countries that there was only two that didn't get colonized. Ethiopia and Liberia were the only two countries that did not, that resisted colonization. Ethiopia right here, Liberia right here, the only two that resisted colonization. So the notebook that you're working in, just to remind you, the World Between the Wars notebook, assignment 28 in 2019, 37 and 38 on that notebook, but it looks like this: Africans against colonial rule. There's a little map at the front. That's where you're taking notes. That's where this follows along. So you may have to stop the video intermittently to get certain points, and that's fine. But here we go. So if you woke up one morning and found that somebody had come to your house and he declared that the house had belonged to him, you would naturally be surprised and would want to know why you want arrangement. Many Africans found now that they were working as squatters or laborers on their own land. What situation is Kenyatta, the Kenyan independence leader, describing in this quote? Think about what he's describing. I would think he would be describing something along the lines of colonization and the sudden European colonization, the British, the French, the Germans, the Belgians, all, the, the Dutch, all of these European powers scrambling to colonize Africa, as you remember from the imperialism. This describes the situation in Africa. So what was he describing in this quote? That's the first question that I've kind of given you some clue for. You may have to stop here and write a sentence or two response. During the early 1900s, every part of Africa was every part of sub-Saharan Africa below in the Sahara was a European colony. The fighting in Africa and the fighting among the Africans wasn't as significant considering the brutality of colonization. They're like, well, this is just another situation that we have to deal with. So the significance in Africa wasn't obvious as great as Europe, but it was there. And who did they fight with? Well, think about it. They probably fought with the people that they're colonizers in the hopes that maybe that they would become, they would earn their freedom from that. The European frenzy to export resources increased the need for cheap workers. So Europeans took the best of everything, and it even became worse during World War One. Imposed taxes, demanded cash crops be grown. Again, cash crops. What are they? Cash crops are crops that cotton, crops like cotton, coffee, beans, cotton that you can get quick money for, that aren't necessarily grains. Sometimes can be cash crops, but aren't necessarily ones that you can grow for food. They're just ones that you can get. Tobacco would be an example. Cash crops that you can get money for, and that's what the Europeans were demanding, that the Africans grow for money, no food. So this cartoon again is saying that this cartoon is saying what? That here's an African slave. Here's the situation with the African slave, and they are taking the situation. Sorry, I had to check. It looked like I had an internet outage there for a minute. They're dragging the Africans through the mud, basically, and mistreating them, stretching them out, trying to get a piece of African labor and African resources. So there were some, Western educated Africans, which makes sense if you think about it, and this kind of helped spur some movements. So educated Africans that could criticize, and this is slide 38 on the next slide as far as the notes, criticize imperial rule and created a political party, eventually called the African National Congress during this time period. Wilson, the call to self-determination, the fact, remember, self-determination, the idea that every country can and every nationality can determine for themselves who's going to rule them. Who was Wilson? I don't know who Wilson was. Socialism found a growing audience. Remember, we talked a lot about socialism. Basically, social control of the factors of production. Could be the people. In the case of the Soviet Union, it could be the government. So that's socialism finds a growing audience. Protests and opposition to imperialism start to become more prevalent. In South Africa, remember you had segregation, and whites are strengthening their grip with racial segregation. What other nation had done this? Those of you who've had U.S., you should know that. That's your hint. Thinking about what other nation has done this that we know about. Jim Crow. That would certainly be a clue. Their goal was to have white economic, political, social supremacy. They restricted blacks from better paying jobs. This ushered in an era of what's called apartheid, where the whites in South Africa are totally in charge and totally treat the blacks as second class citizens. Again, what U.S. laws have been like this? Jim Crow. You're thinking about in the U.S. A scholar. So of course there's a movement toward the response to this is a movement toward Pan-Africanism. And what is Pan-Africanism? And I will get back to, there's another question, what is the negritude movement? I'll get back to that. But first, look at the question, what is Pan-Africanism? So W.E.B. Du Bois, you might know him, organized the first, he was the founder of the NAACP in the United States. He actually had some international activity as well during this time period, right after World War I and the Treaty of Versailles and Wilson's 14 points, organizes a Pan-African Congress in Paris, feeling like at the same time the Allies were holding the Treaty of the Versailles Peace Conference, they wanted a rights for the Africans. They did not get their charter, and they had but they had unified African leaders throughout the world. This is kind of a piecemeal type of activity. When I say that, I mean like what's happening here is that this is kind of a eventually they will get their freedom, but it won't happen until after World War I, basically. I'm going to come back to the resistance and the first countries to gain independence on the second part of this video, and move from there.